Hi. Hello. Well, my mic level will be a little better today. I think I had it a little too far away last time. Sorry about that. Um, Hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving. It was decent. It's quiet, peaceful. You know. Um, so I was talking to a friend of mine recently, and they brought up some paper they had read about essentially the effects of emotional instability in families and how it affects the children and how it manifests later in life, certain types of trauma and wounds. They were specifically talking about the emotional unavailability of most father figures or males, masculine, and the emotional instability or instability of the female counterpart, and how this will manifest into different forms of hypervigilance. Yeah, I think I'm saying that right. Probably not. I'm tired. Uh, Super sensitivity to other people's emotions and children. You could think of it as extremely sensitive empathy, um, but it's a slightly different mechanism, which will then, of course, produce different types of codependency issues. And I'm listening, like, you know. And we got done with her. She got done with her explanation of the paper and everything. I said, "You do realize we've already discussed this on numerous occasions, just not necessarily with that terminology or syntax." She's like, "Yeah, I had a feeling you'd say that." I started laughing. I said, "Oh, really?" And I broke it down into how essentially what she was describing and had been reading about. When you strip out all of the psychological vocabulary, um, you're talking about a divine masculine and a divine feminine wound, which most people have. And it usually manifests in some combination of an abandonment wound as well as a rejection wound. And the conversation continued. We talked a little bit about that, and we talked a little bit more about um, hmm, how to essentially break that cycle, and how most people, myself included, we were raised, and our parents essentially did the best they could, and they taught us what they were taught in a sense. And this is in essence what they call a karmic cycle or a generational curse. Okay. Um, and while, when you look at the details, of course, obviously it's going to manifest in each person in a slightly different way. Some it turns into people pleasing, some get, avoidant attachment styles, all these other. As it's put nowadays in more modern, conventional terms, toxic behavior patterns. Um, and we had a big, long discussion about how these particular things in her life and how they've affected her relationships and the cycle of relationships she's had over and over and over and and over now, which her and I have talked about before, about how, if you keep running into the same type of relationship with basically the same kind of person, what's the common denominator? Well, the common denominator is you. You keep picking the same kind of people. You keep picking the same kind of relationship. Why? Because you're, in essence, energetically and spiritually, you're trying to learn the same lesson or different aspects of the same lesson, which typically would have to do with this earlier wounding. That's not to say everybody suffers from childhood, emotional, mental, spiritual wounds. Most do, not all. Uh, so we talked a lot about that, and how in essence that's, really kind of what karma and dharma is. It's the consequences of your actions. It's not necessarily negative or positive retribution. And we talked a lot about, and this is how, in one of the many, many ways the subconscious mind constantly seeks to validate itself. You witness a form of love under condition or conditional love growing up through your environment, not just from your parents, siblings, friends, peers. And it becomes normal for you. You normalize it. And, it can and oftentimes results in emotional, energetic, and spiritual trauma, wounds, damage. Um, I like to think of them more as blind spots because all of those other terms carry such a heavy negative connotation that they almost sound insurmountable, or that they would be impossible to heal, and that's not true. They are. Absolutely, they are. Now, I can't speak for every kind, obviously, but in my limited experience, the vast majority of them can. So, when you're in conversations with people and you hear things about like divine masculinity, divine femininity, or even toxic masculinity and toxic femininity, which both of those terms have gotten slightly misconstrued in our day and age. Um, Essentially, that's what they're talking about. Um, Everyone has both masculine and feminine energies in them and can display both masculine and feminine properties. Uh, Neither are weak and neither are strong. Together, they can, when properly balanced and both are in healthy equilibrium, they can and will produce a very stable, healthy person. The first task is to truly identify those things and to truly identify, what patterns are you repeating in your life. In my experience through, and of course I'm going to relate this back to addiction because that's what I have most of my experience with, not all, but most. Um, Almost all addicts suffer from one or both of these imbalances, blind spots. Now, you don't have to necessarily get to quite the depth and intensity that I take as far as identifying certain, behaviors, certain wounds, certain traumas that need to be healed, certain blind spots that need to be brought to the awareness to be successful in life or to be, successful in sobriety. You don't have to necessarily know how it works, just that it does. And that once, you know, you start to learn how to practice things like more self-love and all of these other things, all these other little subtle changes of perspective and thinking and whatnot, which will then, of course, change your behavior patterns and the way you react to the world, the way you navigate life on life's terms. Um, you don't necessarily have to know the nitty gritty details, the the psychology or the emotional basis, the spiritual or energetic basis behind all of these patterns and why throughout your life you have sought out certain things or been attracted to certain situations and people and how and why you developed these unhealthy coping mechanisms. You just have to have faith in the fact that once you surrender to the fact that you've only been doing the best you could is with what you were taught, and that making those unhealthy choices doesn't make you a bad person. It's once you stop fighting yourself and the system and everything else around you, and you can get yourself to a point where you're no longer just constantly in a state of reaction, you can start to recreate yourself in your life so that you no longer feel like you have to escape it. Now, that's not to say that you can't go that deep, because you can. Absolutely. Just oftentimes that's the first kind of big chunk of the journey. But back to, the conversation I was having with my friend, I myself have suffered from both of those particular types of wounds. Where my self-worth issues came from was essentially my father's side. Um, and my fears of rejection and abandonment came from my mother's side. I've done a lot of work on both. Was it done, was this something they did on purpose? No, of course not. Did they try to teach me unconditional love as best they could? Yes, absolutely. Of that, I have no doubt. I myself do not have children, but I have multiple sisters that all have children, and I know a lot of people with kids. It's a very rare exception that a parent doesn't truly unconditionally love their children, regardless of the behavior or actions. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to accept bad behavior or actions from that child, but they will always love that child. There's a particular bond there that is just unbreakable, really. I'm definitely going to do probably a whole series on this particular topic. Uh, I meant to actually make this video a couple of days ago when the conversation was fresh in my mind, and unfortunately, I didn't get the opportunity to until now. So I guess the point to all of this is this: in my experience, a vast majority of the population have experienced these particular types of emotional, mental, energetic, and spiritual wounds. Um, and there's purpose behind it. That was how where the conversation evolved into was, why would a particular soul choose to experience these things? Of course, there's always free will as the monkey wrench thrown into everything. We'll get into that later. But the long and short of it is, the point to life is life itself. The point to life is to experience these things, as I've stated many times before. You can't have good without bad, and so forth and so on. And, to truly know unconditional love, you have to know love under condition. It's just kind of how it works. Why are there so many people on this planet who are going through this particular type of healing journey? Well, I personally think it's got to do with the fact that we're moving into a new age. Age of Aquarius. Finally. um, we talked a lot about that. We talked about how the previous age was the age of Pisces, which was all about getting a better emotional foundation into life and the love of the self. And now the age of Aquarius is going to expound upon that. Once the love of the self is achieved, then it's the love of the good or the whole, the love of the other, and how we will start to change and evolve as a race and as a society to better encompass what is good for the whole. And there's all kinds of spiritual and religious aspects to all of that. And there's certain cycles of progress that we go through spiritually, emotionally, mentally, physically, culturally. You can look back through history and you can see how these cycles actually kind of overlap each other. We got into a lot of that. I'll probably talk about that in greater detail sooner than later. It was a very interesting conversation. It got pretty deep. Locked my doors. Um, we're going to start with the basics, though. Yes, man or woman, you have both masculine and feminine energies in you. And you can display the properties of either one at any given time. And if you display one more than the other, that doesn't make you strong or weak. Sometimes you have to, there are many, many women I know out there who have to display and be in a much more masculine energy due to circumstance or work or whatever. I mean, essentially every single mother out there does. They're there right now. And there are many men I know who have to resonate more in their feminine energy. I'm actually one of them, usually. I'm much more balanced than I used to be with both. For you tarot readers out there, essentially temperance. Um, so just because somebody uses that term doesn't mean it's not gender. It's not what it's about. And, the other kind of point to this particular message is, if you start to think of things in your life in terms of what is the lesson I need to learn and what part of me energetically is trying to learn that lesson, um, things can and will start to make a little more sense. Um, in my experience, anyway. As like with this conversation, once we kind of got into a few of the more of the details and minutia of these particular types of wounds and how to identify them and heal them and how they manifest, there were many light bulbs that went off in this person's head, like, oh, shit, that's what I've been doing for 30 years. Yeah. you know, that's why, they kept picking a very similar or a basically not similar as in physical attributes, no. But when you look at the relations that you've been in, the relationships you've been in, when she started to look at these people more as an energetic lesson, she could very much identify the similarities between all of them and how she had essentially repeated the same relationship over and over and over, like 5 or 6 times now. And it's like, okay, so what is it? What lesson are you not learning? You know, that's kind of where the conversation left off. It's the same thing, you know. And I've said that before in other videos. I see everything in terms of energy and spiritualism and a lot of other things. I really do. I just don't necessarily always get into that because when I do, I come across as intimidating or too intense and too deep, and people can't follow it and all this other shit. The other funny thing about that conversation was we've been into it, for a little bit, and all of a sudden she's like, "Huh?" I said, "What?" She's like, "You knew exactly where this conversation was going to lead." She's like, "And you've been prepping me for this exact moment for months now." I said, "Yep." Kind of blew her mind a little. I was happy with that because it's rare that the seeds I plant, it's rare for me to get to see them germinate and let alone bear fruit. Um, so it was wonderful, quite nice. Said it many many times. There's a method to my madness, and there's a madness to my method. I've planted seeds in people that 15, 20 years later, I've run into them and they're like, one time you said this. 10 years after that, it finally clicked and blah, blah, blah. I don't necessarily even do it consciously sometimes. It just happens. That's one of the ways I'm a light worker, or an earth angel, as some call it. So, yeah, there's definitely going to be some deeper topics coming. Recently read some comments on the channel I follow. Somebody had, like, I think it was 2 days sober. And it's like, you know what? That's awesome. And the cool thing was the outpouring that this person received after that, the numerous comments that came through that were like, hey, congratulations. We know it's hard. I've got this amount of time. Of course I responded to. I was like, hey, I just recently had 2 years. Trust me, I know. People talk about the first 30 days being the hardest shit. That first week is insanely tough. You know, that's why they talk about one day at a time. All you got to do is make it through 24 hours. Hell, not even, because out of that 24 hours, how many of those hours are you gonna sleep? 8, 10, 12? So, yeah, I'm tired. So, I hope everyone has a blessed night. I know this one wasn't very succinct. I apologize for that. It was kind of just thinking out loud. And I think that's what I'm going to title it. So, blessed be.